Check 1, 2.
Hello. Are we on? Hi. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, can you hear us okay?
Give me a second. I think I can. Can you say something?
Check 1, 2. Check 1, 2.
Yeah, it's kind of it's quite quiet, but it's okay. I can hear you. How's the sound levels?
You sound
You sound
fantastic.
fantastic. Okay, that's good. So that shouldn't be a problem then. I also took my headphones, but I don't think I'm gonna need them then.
Okay. Okay.
There's the weird thing about lag, which is quite not a big surprise with the distance and everything, but it's funny to see myself doing everything a tiny bit late. 3 second avant-garde experimental film lag of watching oneself.
Yeah. If you just talk into one of the mics.
Yeah, because otherwise it's really quiet.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can. Hi.
Hi, so this is Doug, and he is our IT guy. So he's going to be the one kind of switching the cameras and things like that. Did you have a slideshow you wanted to show?
No, because I knew that just in case it's going to be tricky, I didn't do one.
Okay,
So I thought it'd be kind of more straightforward.
great. Okay, so yeah, we're going to get started. I think Janet's going to welcome everybody around 8:30, and then we could do a couple things. Like blinking the screen?
Oh, it's good. Enough on our side.
Okay. So uh, I guess it's kind of up to you. So since we have about 45 minutes till you officially talk, we can just kind of leave you on the screen like how you look now. I think you can see yourself. So we could do that, or we could blank. You can actually blank your own screen in audio if you want to do something else. Make
Mm,
coffee. I don't know. So
let's see. Let me try.
okay.
So this is probably fine now, right?
Oh yeah, this
Yeah,
is fine.
this is fine.
And
As
then,
you can see what the audience will see, and so that's just the blank screen. And then
yeah,
we can still hear you up in the corner. So
let me
if
do
this
a
works.
test.
Okay.
Let me do a test. I'm gonna do the audio. I'm gonna mute the microphone, and I'll after a while I'll say something. Let's see if you hear me or not. I'll say your numbers or something.
Okay. Yep, we can't hear you. So you are muted.
So you couldn't hear me.
Nope, not at all. So
Brilliant. Okay, because I'll probably then leave this on, but muted and video off as well. Hello.
okay.
Hi, UC. I'm Janet.
Oh, hello. Hi. Nice to meet you this way as well.
Oh, nice to meet you. Am I facing you? No.
That's the
Yeah, I can see you.
camera.
Now you're facing me.
Great to see you on the screen, and we're
It's
happy you're.
fantastic. Everything seems to be working, and thanks to you all for being very patient with me as well in terms of everything organizational and so forth.
Yeah, it's fine. It's fine. I'll give you back the speaker.
Yeah. So basically, 8:30 you're going to start with something. So I'll get online and start listening probably 8:40, and I'll listen in for a cue. Is somebody going to introduce me, and then we'll start, or how do we do that?
Yes. What we'll do is we'll do a few things that I'll introduce a couple of videos, and then
Mhm.
I will introduce Regina Lawrence, who will then be introducing you. So that
Okay.
hopefully, and that'll be around 8:45. That's what I'm thinking.
Sounds fine.
Yep.
Because then I said I've got the short talk, which I think should definitely be within 25 minutes.
Okay, yeah, that would be good.
Yeah.
I think
So, and
I
after
think
that
that
we can do. Sorry.
is about the right time. I think going over that might 25 would be good.
Yeah. And after that we'll do a really short Q&A, and after that I can log off, right?
Yes, absolutely. And it will be, we'll have to make it relatively short because then we follow up with Toby Miller as the
Yeah.
second part of the plenary. So I think it
Yeah.
will be
Absolutely
short.
fine.
Okay, great.
One quick question, really, really quickly. Did you? I think it was you who said something about Skype as well.
Yes, actually, there after you sign off,
Yeah.
I'm not sure of these arrangements, quite honestly, because I wasn't organizing that. But we have a very, very short interview, just a couple of questions that we have been interviewing, especially the plenary speakers about. And so, someone, if you are available just for a few minutes after, someone can contact you by Skype and just do a very, very, very short interview about some
Yeah, I
questions
think
that
it should
pertain
be
to the
fine.
theme. Is that all right?
Yeah, I think it should be fine, definitely. Thank you. I
Okay,
mean, it's I'll log on to Skype after that to see if somebody contacts me.
that would be great. Thank you, Yusi. Wish you were
Thank you
here.
so much. Hmm?
how how was Italy, by the way?
Italy was fine. I gave a talk in Helsinki yesterday, so it's kind of
Oh,
a like a weird week of very various displacements, and
yeah,
I'm glad that I can do at least this way the Portland thing as well.
right. We were too. But it would have
Yeah,
been very nice to have you here, but this is going to be fine too. So,
I know. I'm gutted that I couldn't make it, but Toby is there, right?
yes, yes, he's here.
Good, excellent.
So, okay. I don't know what I am supposed to do now.
I'll log off and I'll be
Oh,
back
you're logging
around.
off. Okay.
Well, I'll leave things on, but it should be 8:40. I'll be listening in, and I'll kind of
Great.
switch on my video at some point as well around that time.
Great. Okay.
Okay.
Super.
See you
Thanks.
soon.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Hi, everyone. I'm Michael Schill, the president of the University of Oregon. I'm pleased to welcome you to the What is Life conference, experience and exhibition at UO Portland. I regret that I'm not able to join you, but I anticipate that you are in for an exciting and thought provoking couple of days as researchers, teachers, students, and community members explore communication, media, and nature by examining everyday life. This unique experience is the collaboration of the School of Journalism and Communications, School of Architecture and Allied Arts, and the College of Arts and Sciences. This event builds upon the success of last year's What is Media conference.
Now, out of this.
Well, media is such a broad term, but media are the kind of, for me, the kind of forms that we use as humans to transmit our experiences to one another. And in fact, I think about a quote by the comic book artist Scott McCloud, who says that media are those inventions that we've created because we can't communicate directly mind to mind.
That we need for most of us, I think our engagements with media and mediation, the process of mediation, is essentially searching for the right medicine that we need to feel good.
Oh, these are the. Oh, that would be great. You're just gonna talk. Very simple. So I wanted to. Okay, so once we come out of one, will it automatically? Oh, oh, but then I can stop it because I'm.
Hi, everyone. I'm Michael Schill, the president of the University of Oregon. Again, welcome, and I wish you an enlightening and memorable experiences as you explore what is life.
This. Okay. This. Oh.
Good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me on increasing the country in medicine climate change. Even in this 500 act, 37%, and in Kenya, 53%. The fossil fuel lobbies, powered by $500 billion in annual subsidies, will not be easily defeated, but the window of change is opening, and the choice is yours.
Stop it right around there. Okay. 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 And then PowerPoints to run. Yeah, we won't have PowerPoints, but at that point we'll get ready for that. Yeah. Cool. First say hello. Presidential.
Just double click on this one and it'll start this.
Okay, great.
I think what we should do is we should just start with Oak School now.
I'll let you guys argue this out.
Thank
No,
you.
no, we're not arguing.
No, we're we've got.
I mean, it's only going to be 7 minutes. Or 7 minutes. Start with Oak School.
Set this up.
Oh, no, I know.
Flow
No, I know. No,
the
all we have to do is move it up.
Okay, do it.
Okay. All we do is this. No? Starting with this.
So this set up flows right.
I'm sorry, statistics are going to have to be like that mob in the square in Romania, mob in the past. It is claimed that poor countries care less about environmental threats, but when a world public opinion poll asks if the struggle against climate change should be given priority, even if this would slow economic growth and cost jobs, in the USA only 14% agreed unconditionally. In France, $500 billion in annual subsidies will not be easily defeated, but the window of change is opening, and the choice is yours.
What is life?
Well, media is such a broad term, but media are the kind of
You want to start?
Okay, we can start.
Would you prefer? Good. No, no, don't quit. Don't quit. Yeah. I just want to know why. Was that? Where's our opener? It's good. Keep it in. And upstairs, and so, president, his media. That's what's needed. That's it. Right. You. Yeah, that's good. There it is. And it'll play right in a row. So go ahead and just introduce it the way you want.
Is that okay? Oh yeah. You're right. I need you. No, but don't just.
Well, media is such a broad term, but media are the kind of, for me, the kind of forms that we use as humans to transmit our experiences to one another. And in fact, I think about a quote by the comic book artist Scott McCloud, who says that media are those inventions that we have created because we can't communicate directly mind to mind.
The media is a increasingly media will be dynamic and it will have computer intelligence inside of it. And the question then becomes, does it work for us or does it replace us? And
I think the media, you can think perhaps of it as a kind of virus, and its role could be both curative and reparative, and also kind of infectious. And you don't kind of know what's going to happen, and this is probably what's most exciting about various kinds of media.
The body itself is going to become much more of an open system for design. So we sort of see the body now as a closed system.
All things, because the more things are connected, the better things work. And a lot of the ways, increasingly, that things are connected is through media. And the more media evolves and gets better and more powerful and more inclusive, the more connectivity does all those things. And the more people are connected, the safer people tend to be.
For most of us, I think our engagements with media and mediation, the process of mediation, is essentially searching for the right medicine that we need to feel good about being alive.
Hi, everyone. I'm Michael Schill, the president of the University of Oregon. I'm pleased to welcome you to the What is Life conference, Experience and Exhibition at UO Portland. I regret that I'm not able to join you, but I anticipate that you are in for an exciting and thought-provoking couple of days as researchers, teachers, students, and community members explore communication, media, and nature by examining everyday life. This unique experience is the collaboration of the School of Journalism and Communications, the School of Architecture and Allied Arts, and the College of Arts and Sciences. This event builds upon the success of last year's What is Media conference, experience, and continues to expand and reinforce the University of Oregon's strong commitment to interdisciplinary research and inquiry. I hope that this opportunity helps you stretch your imagination of how we are all influenced and interact with the arts, sciences, and environment in our lives. Again, welcome, and I wish you an enlightening and memorable experiences as you explore what is life.
Okay, welcome again for those of you who are back this morning. Yes. And we have a very brief visit from someone who couldn't join us today, and it will be an excerpt from a presentation that Jacob van Uxkel sent to us because he couldn't attend. Van Uxkel is the founder of the World Future Council, and he also is the founder of something called the Right Livelihood Awards, also known as the Alternative Nobel Prizes. He has been a member of the European Parliament. He is the grandson of Jacob van Uxkel, who was a biologist and founder of study of biosemiotics. His comments about sustainable policies for future generations, and we'll listen to some of those before we proceed with our other presentations by Jussi Parikka and Toby Miller.
Good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me, and I'm sorry I cannot be with you in person. Our ancestors sometimes saw themselves as living in historically important times of change and transition. But today there can be no doubt that we live at a crucial time in human history. Our decisions and actions and our failures to act will have an impact on future generations for centuries, possibly for millennia or even for geological time periods. In his book Collapse, an overview of failed civilizations, Jared Diamond notes that the most frequent cause of their collapse was their holding on for too long to outdated belief systems which had once served them well, indeed provided the foundations for their success. Over the last century, Western Europe and North America developed a new belief system and political ideology, economic growth, which not surprisingly has spread all over the world as it promises paradise on earth for all. Warnings of natural limits were ridiculed and could be evaded for a while by growing into the ecological and economic space of other countries. But today, every living system is declining, and the rate of decline is accelerating. Important rules like do not poison the water, a capital crime for our ancestors, or soil or air, have been broken. Can we still reverse course in time? Well, history offers many examples of people overcoming seemingly impossible odds. Slavery abolitionists were the first to create an international movement to defend the rights of those they did not know. At that time, 3 out of 4 people in the world were enslaved. Abolitionists were ridiculed and told they would ruin the economy. But within a few decades, their moral crusade succeeded in delegitimizing slavery all over the world. In 1941, the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill told US President Roosevelt that he had no defense against a Nazi invasion and urgently needed planes and ships in huge numbers. Roosevelt called in the leaders of US industry, who said his demands were impossible. Roosevelt then enacted the Selective Service Act, allowing him to nationalize uncooperative factories, and the industrialists quickly changed course. By 1943, so only 2 years later, a plane was produced every 4 minutes, a tank every 7 minutes, and 2 seagoing ships every day. Roosevelt biographer Doris Kearns Goodwin writes, ironically, while the leaders of industry clung to a static view of the American economy, it was Roosevelt and his impractical theorists who held a powerful vision of the country's potential to produce more than anyone had ever dreamt possible. So visionary leaders expand the limits of possibility. But where, you may well ask, are these leaders today? Capable to inspire and motivate us to heed the increasingly desperate warnings of the scientific community. By confronting the very inconvenient truth that current policies are leading not to a global paradise, but to the collapse of human civilization, possibly even of life on Earth. That ever-increasing consumption is imperative worldwide is still their basic belief system. When told that this is not physically possible, they are lost. In Japan today, many in the young generation are increasingly anti-consumerist, striving for satori, personal enlightenment. Instead of celebrating their example, this drives economists and politicians in Japan and elsewhere to despair, as they accuse them of destroying growth. But climate change is now the defining issue of our time and the greatest challenge wherever you live. It will create a huge refugee crisis for which we're neither politically nor morally prepared. In Bangladesh, 50,000 people already migrate to the capital every month because rising sea levels have made their villages uninhabitable and destroyed their arable land. The former head of the IMF, Michel Kamdasou, expects hundreds of millions of African climate refugees to try to reach Europe in the coming decades because they can no longer survive at home. While many will no doubt perish on the way, enough will arrive to make South European countries increasingly ungovernable failed states. So how are we reacting to this growing emergency? The depressing truth is that we were further 25 years ago. In a 1989 New York Times CBS poll, 80% in the USA agreed that, quote, protecting the environment is so important that standards cannot be too high and continuing environmental improvements must be made regardless of cost, end of quote. What happened in the meantime? A few years ago, a Princeton University study concluded that the USA no longer fulfills the criteria of a democracy, but those of an oligarchy. And in the UK, while 3/4 of the population believe that the climate is changing because of human activity, only half of members of parliament do. 71% of conservative MPs agree with Donald Trump that human-induced climate change is either unproven or environmentalist propaganda. But how relationships can change very quickly when the time is ripe. In May 1989 in Moscow, a West German government representative assured his East German colleague that nobody in the West is thinking of changing the status of Berlin. The wall, as we know, fell 6 months later. Suddenly the old order collapsed, and so-called ordinary people, who had the trust of their fellow citizens, found themselves brought together at the famous round tables in East Germany and elsewhere to steer their country into the future. In the coming crisis, this could be your role. The president of China said recently that we must live in harmony with nature and unremittingly pursue self-renewal. He also declared his aim of building a moderately prosperous society, being well aware that the per capita resource consumption in the West cannot be replicated in China. This is just physically not possible. This, of course, raises a question of its justification here. As economic growth cannot deliver our living standards for all without ruining the planet, issues of global justice and equity can no longer be avoided. Serious leaders in the global south are well aware that duplicating the Western development model would destroy their environment, even if the CO2 emissions in the industrialized countries fell to zero. As the late Prime Minister of Ethiopia, Meles Zenawi, said, equitable access to a train wreck is not a desirable goal. Neither is it equity or justice to foul the planet because others have done it in the past. It is claimed that poor countries care less about environmental threats, but when a world public opinion poll asks if the struggle against climate change should be given priority, even if this would slow economic growth and cost jobs, in the USA only 14% agreed unconditionally, in France 23%, in Turkey 37%, and in Kenya 53%. The fossil fuel lobbies, powered by $500 billion in annual subsidies, will not be easily defeated, but the window of change is opening, and the choice is yours.
We'll end with that challenge and move to the next part of our plenary this morning. And I'd like to introduce Regina Lawrence. I'm not speaking in the mic, very sorry. Regina Lawrence is from our Turnbull Center here, and she will introduce our two plenary speakers.
Hi, good morning. Welcome. We're delighted to have you all here. Welcome to Portland. Welcome to the University of Oregon in Portland. Welcome to the School of Journalism and Communication in Portland. One of the things that is so exciting about the What Is conference every year is that we literally connect people from different parts of the world, and we're going to see different kinds of connection this morning. I believe we have a telepresence joining us soon. I love that term, telepresence. So I guess my role is simply to introduce our two speakers, and I think it will be followed by some discussion after each of these talks. We have UC Parika with the University of Southampton, and Toby Miller with, I should have studied how to pronounce this. How do I pronounce it? Loughborough University in London. And I believe, is she ready to join us? UC is standing by.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, there he is.
Okay, very good.
Fantastic.
Welcome.
Okay. Welcome, Professor Parika. Please take it away.
Good morning. I believe it's rather early morning there, if I'm not mistaken. It's probably easier for me than for you because it's about 7 o'clock. I'm in Finland at the moment, in a small town in southeast Finland, where the other part of the railroad track takes to Helsinki, and the other railroad track direction goes towards Russia. So that's slightly different kind of a location. I know that we have quite a tight time restriction, so I'm going to give a really short talk. But before that, I want to thank organizers for inviting me and also for accepting that this telepresence. It makes it much easier for me, especially nowadays that crossing borders is itself a rather political act. But also, even if I really would have wanted to join you there, because sort of the presentations and talks are again sounding very exciting. So congratulations to organizers for setting up this really exciting event. And also, I really wanted to be on the same panel with Toby Miller. So kind of we are now, even if I'm not there. So anyway, when I was thinking about what to talk about, one idea I had in mind is that I would talk about my earlier work in artificial life in relation to software cultures since 1980s and the question of what artificial life meant. But I decided to do something else, something that I've been doing the past times, especially that is more about environmental issues, environmental waste, and something that again connects Toby's work really well as well. But I'll start with a question. I'll start with a question of where should one even start to unfold the question of life? Life and denial of life, life and its conditions, life that as a question feels rather abstract. Abstract only because it is not merely about biological bodies, but also technological culture. To make sense of the life of technological culture. And to ask the question that might sound at first abstract and absurd even, is there life of media? So as we know, Mark Deuce talks about media life. But besides our practices of living in relation to media, what else would there be in a topic that relates to the wider environmental and political sense of the topic? As mentioned, I could have talked about artificial life and the long legacy of artificial life, not only the past 30, 40 years of software artificial life, but other ways as well. But I decided to do something else, something that at the same time is perhaps rather fundamental in relation to what we do in media, but also rather concrete in terms of the urgency of something that relates quite closely to what we just heard through Jakob von Uexküll as well. So my aim today is to give a brief insight into one particular form of understanding the lifespan of a technological object, and to demonstrate the life of technology that is not merely about the user, but at least the usual way that we understand use and users, or even the assigned meanings, but the wider material history and the wider material geographies that it occupies and forms. So it expanded its sense of media life after life as well. So obviously this argument relates to some issues of environmental importance of life that is more than one specific substance successful in the tick box exercise of is it alive, is it not alive? And it's more about sort of a recognition that pertains to the formations of digital technology as something that is planetary, material, and not merely about use value in the narrow sense. It also connects what I'm going to be talking about briefly, connects to colonial histories that are constantly recycled as material infrastructures of exploitation. So the life of media is also about the dead waters, dead lands, to modify Saskia Sassen's reminder that to speak of climate change is actually a way too nice of a framing. We need something more of a, apt terms for these. So in my book, A Geology of Media, I attempted to offer one particular vocabulary for this situation. So it aimed to offer one way of approaching media technologies, not through these use values only and practices of what do we do with media. In other words, from the usual horizon of expectation of what do we do with media to how they fall out of use as environmental waste, and how before media becomes media in our sense, it is actively and materially produced out of the various geophysical materials, from minerals to a range of energy transactions. So hence, at least implicitly, I wanted to put the media technological modernity in conversation with the Anthropocene, that term for the particularly nasty technological waste period we are living, and something that is often, of course, discussed in relation to its periodization as part of industrial production or industrial revolution. Or as Benjamin Bratton puts it, the Anthropocene can be seen as a long-term design brief, a long-term design brief that went really, really wrong. And now it would be a matter of urgently to redesign and undo that design brief with another brief. But besides these scales that are temporally and geographically vast, the effects, or even on small scales, the effects of media technologies as a sort of politics of disuse, a politics of dead media, persists as the materially toxic afterlife that is hard to ignore. So besides in that book, many other researchers, artists, NGOs have documented the landscapes and situations where scavenging discarded media technologies for their useful components and metals is also a health hazard. Yesterday, I was giving a talk in Helsinki at Kiasma Museum in a very different kind of event, and we got an insight to the new exhibition on digital art, R17. There was a rather wonderful exhibition, but there was also a really beautiful installation of broken plasma screens that the artist had broken, and it was a very stunning way of contemporary sculpture as well. But the only thing I was kind of thinking all the time is in terms of the actual processes of how she dismantled those and how aware she was of those conditions of toxicity and as I will explain a bit more soon. So this toxicity I kind of always thought through a chart, a sort of a chart of the dark underbelly of digital media through those hazardous materials. For example, the materials as part of what they cause, especially when exposed more directly with human labor and enter the human organism. The media that is actually about lead, cadmium, mercury, barium, and more, and hence all those materials that cause damage to nervous systems, blood systems, internal organs from kidneys to the brain, etc., etc. That is the other sort of a narrative about dangers of media as material afterlife of toxicity. And it also spurs the idea that we can talk about the chemical history, a chemical reality of media life, that is the residual waste of technological culture. So there would be an odd mix of chemistry and anthropology of media of non-use, an anthropology of media non-use, of media obsolete, discarded and toxically affecting the livelihood of masses of people who deal with this sort of a legacy, not by way of accidents, but by way of historical and geographical structuring of the global media economy as well. So in a recent text that is, I think is still forthcoming in a collection called After Extinction, the visual culture scholar Nicholas Mirzoev addresses the political history of the Anthropocene. Obviously, he's not the only one, but I'll use that as a really good entry point. So this, he argues, is to ask, in his words, what kind of a man is it that underlies the notion of the Anthropocene? What sort of a historical lineage of control or forms of knowledge conditions this planetary fate or understanding of the planetary fate or in technological culture? A culture that is the situation of a massive scale disaster of those dying waters, dying lands, and dying people. Mirzoev's effective provocation is a nod to the particularly important questions of life, read through the historically significant themes concerning race and ethnicity, a lens through that he offers through Black Lives Matter to questions of colonization and enslavement as they persist in different guises nowadays as well, from logistics to epistemology. The perception about the particular boundaries that were set, boundaries where we assume that nature stops and culture begins, as one formation of colonial power historically as well. And this is a story that also art historians know well in terms of how colonial lineages were concretely also painted. Look at landscape paintings, for instance. So besides the explosively racist politics of violence that pertains to US society, and not only to US society, we know, Mercer outlines the longer-term durations of neo-colonialism that any politics of the Anthropocene has to really account with. So he takes aim at how questions of life are articulated across the historical durations that relate to the concept of the Anthropocene. This geological concept, as many other theorists have shown too, is also part of political and technological history, and in this case also part of the colonial domination that still persists. Again, it's a theme that is noted by other key writers as well, such as Saskia Sassen and many others. But with the likes of Mirzoeff, it also becomes an issue we can discuss and more easily discuss in visual and media studies. In Mirzoeff's words, there is, I quote, a color line enshrined in natural history, which comes out both in rhetorics, to speak of humans as geological masters, and in the infrastructural arrangement as to how consumer products, money and waste flow across planetary geographies. So what he knows how natural historical marks relating to geological events, the knowledge about nature and particular discourses of extinction are embedded in forms of knowledge that had a strong link to colonial fiction as well. But besides this remediation of colonial forms of division, there is also a particularly non-representational form of neo-colonialism that pertains to this topic and the weird life, the death, and afterlife of media. So again, my geology of media participated in the discussions about environmental waste and its particularly specified entry into regions of the global south, such as Western Africa, India, Pakistan. In more detail, Sean Cupid's recent book, in Finite Media, I actually have a copy with me, does the same thing. So Cupid's environmental media message is evident from the title already. It comes out as an argument about the finite material conditions in which media culture, as energy, as resources, and as extraction, is determined in relation to geographies that determine in our modern times in relation to colonial histories. So in Cupid's terminology, waste is an integral part of digital media culture as it is expressed in energy costs and in the actual discarded electronics that are not merely an accidental part of the cycle of media life, but an integral and incidental to its existence. The waste dumped on it and the particularly exposed human groups is the integral waste that is produced as a necessary externality of the global situation. This circuit is very much conditioned along the historical legacies as well. Partly it relates decades of outsourcing of production to countries of cheaper labor in different locations in Asia, not least of course China, and partly in the longer term histories of colonialism. As Cupid puts it, I quote his words, contemporary continues colonialism in the global south by way of exocolonialism, but also internally in the global north as endocolonialism. And this produces a situation that has its own grim political history, but also, of course, a grim political present as well. It's something that has to do with geographies of resource extraction of certain parts of, for instance, Africa as one center of mining, as well as energy mining, energy-related mining, of production of cheap labor in poorly regulated work conditions, of dumping electronics as part of the second cycle of media reuse, which often has to do with extraction through hazardous means, such as through burning PVC casings and such. To make the argument even more focused, Cupid points to centrality of indigenous areas for many of these concerns. This is where extraction industries and the logic of exploitation becomes clearest. Articulating this in relation to media studies, he argues that the dependence on fossil fuels and on particular minerals and related resources is the reason why an expanded look at this environmental and political condition is relevant also from an aesthetic perspective. So it's this sort of a media aesthetic that is radically expanded from what happens on the screen to what made the screen possible. So whereas some software studies some years ago moved beyond screen essentialism to the software and other infrastructure, Cupid's take, like also mine and other scholars as well, takes this further to the material and political conditions of existence of this particular link between material production and extraction industries, and perhaps a certain kind of semiotic production of this situation of how that's something that I will briefly return to as well. So to trace these elements as mobile digital culture to these constituent metals is one vector of aesthetic knowledge, an articulation of scales as politically significant. Scales of geography and nature culture, or nature culture as one word as Donna Haraway taught us in such brilliant ways early on in different contexts. For example, lithium's mineral extraction industry and the massive impact on ecology in Chile is weirdly enough noted even by such right-wing press as Daily Mail, something that also Sean Cupid quotes, and how the production of materials of media is unfortunately correlating with the disappearance of animal life. And I wouldn't usually quote Daily Mail, but this time we'll let it go. So in the words of Daily Mail, in the parched hills of Chile's northern region, the damage caused by lithium mining is immediately clear. As one of the country's largest lithium mines, the wide landscape gives way to what appears to be an endless plowed field. Huge mountains of this soil rise out of the plain. The cracked brown earth of the site crumbles in your hands. There is no sign of animal life anywhere. The scarce water has all been poisoned by chemicals leaked from the mine. And of course, there would be a longer history of this, the legacy of mercury and silver mining, production in the Andes as part of the early colonial gestures of the 17th century as well. And there's a weird kind of a theme of disappearance of animal life in this context of production of technological culture. So I would say that, and Cupid's message seems to be as well, that sort of a weirdly, well, let's use the word responsible. A responsible media studies perspective seems to start from these seemingly external conditions of life, seemingly external in certain ways. In other words, energy use, geographies of those infrastructures, mining and more. While not directly linked to media, perhaps, it becomes relevant to start to discuss the various recent political infrastructures put in place. And of course, we would know that there's a lot of these cases. Also in contested areas such as Keystone XL pipeline and its particular visibility on indigenous lands because of protests. The aesthetics of the protest, aesthetics in a very fundamental sense, and camps that the activists have managed to achieve by campaigns is the other important phase of visibility when it comes to the material trails of these plans. Also, Cupid explains related to pipeline, of course, before the recent events as well, the past months, because the book came out last year, recently, but still. What the plans involve, of course, is actually transporting of diluted bitumen, which has its own relevance to the issue. While extracting oil from bitumen itself is environmentally costly, the substance itself is more acidic and hence acidic and high in sulfur, increased possibility of problems in the pipeline and problems such as spills on a small level as well. This itself is not news, and it's not news literally. As Cupid underlines, media coverage and the ingesting of minor leaks rarely takes place, while Deepwater Horizon and similar accidents itself are really media events about the conditions of technological culture, about oil, or even sometimes tens of thousands of minor leaks in various pipelines, such as the Alberta pipeline since the 1990s. They are rarely news. As media events, they can be said to be weird non-events, perhaps that Mackenzie Walk means when using the term. The idea of a global weird media events as something that of a spectacle that synchronizes, in Walk's words, very diverse local times that becomes part of everyday discussions, connecting what we consider local to what we consider global. But as Mackenzie Walk adds, I quote, yet for all of that, it proves remarkably difficult to think back to the causes of the event itself. And this itself is particularly central to the ways in which planetary level infrastructures move in and outside actual realms of experience. As one way, think of aesthetics at the center of this political issue as well. It is also in this context of events and also in the context of non-events, in perception, that one becomes aware of the mediations of materiality, of mediations as co-determining forces. So to speak of aesthetics of visibility is constantly entangled in this sort of material history and chemical qualities of fuels, of pipelines, and other. I'm going to do really short conclusions as well by way of a parallel, so to make sure that I'm on time. So basically the question of what is life obviously expands to last year's questions. What is media? But importantly, where is media and to whom is media in this sense, and what sort of things count as media? The particular angle, the use of media as its life open up to colonial histories and political geographies in which media is being produced from material level upwards. Media as issues of production of those material levels does not diminish what could be called the political aesthetics of media, but it actually expands it. This aesthetics is about perception, and it's also about the concept as it concerns what scales of media use and media non-use are counted as part of our analyses and research frameworks. From scales of use and community and political debates to scales of material interactions that's also speculative and at times synchronized as weird media events, perhaps. But also consider like this, and it's a slight small parallel towards the end. So recently I read the news as well that scientists have observed how the so-called Anthropocene period especially been marked by an emergence of a new sort of life or new sorts of life in ways, a burgeoning of new geological worlds, which is a massive increase in new minerals. This explosion is partly also related to industrialization and the new chemical reactions these particularly important materials of technological culture have when they are oxidized or hydrated for longer durations, 100 years. Hence return to interaction with planetary materials, planetary temperatures, planetary conditions. To quote from one of the sources of the news, in their words, these human-triggered minerals include chalconatronite, that crystallizes as bright blue crust on ancient Egyptian bronze artifacts, and andesonite, a uranium-laced mineral with a fluorescent green or yellow glow that forms on the walls of mine tunnels. The bronze-hued apurite was developed on the wreck of SS Cheerful, which sank off the coast of Cornwall, England in 1885, and only formed because of a chemical reaction between the salt water and the ship's sunken supply of tin. What seem to be like random examples are part of a bigger chemical reaction that is scale more than the individual remains of technological artifacts, ships, computer screens, or the other leftovers from the earthly record of media and technology. It would be a rather apt way to start a science fiction novel of a synthetic ooze that starts to spread across the planet as alien life, entering not from the outer world, but from the insides of the current forms of production of technological culture. Perhaps you can also call it capitalism. You can also call it neo-colonialism. In our case, it's connected to a sort of a different explanation or a story, which indeed has to do with planetary scale-logical life. But this laboratory of life is the other side of what comes out as waste as well. So this emergence of new sorts of life, of minerals, of unseen before, is connected to the realities of increasing amounts of dead media and deadly text. So the particular ways in which we narrate the emergence of new synthetic materials out of waste is also entangled with how we narrate the particular necropolitics of media too. So the usual ways in which we narrate dead media and obsolescence in media archaeology has been useful, and it has, in a way, related to this kind of afterlife of media. But we also need to think of the long lessons as an aesthetic impulse that is not merely about aesthetics as art projects. It's about nature and the body as integral ways, to use Cupid's terms, and one of deadly consequences, and demands a particular way of looking at dead media in our culture of media life as well. It is not aesthetics about art projects, but about aesthetics that is the necessary way and the massive scales of these issues of environmentality and media life. And this is where I'm going to finish. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Parika. We'd like to take just a few questions, and I've got a microphone here so Professor Parika can hear us. Does anyone, can I see some hands for questions? Check. Okay.
Hi. Simple question. It's not so simple. Oh yeah, I'm Mark Johnson from the philosophy department at University of Oregon. Would you say more about what you mean by aesthetics? Because we're all about in some of these sessions an expansive notion, an enriched notion of the aesthetic that is different from its use in, say, 18th century German philosophy. So you said at the very end, you hinted at how you were expanding this. Would you say a little bit more about the term?
Yes, thank you very much. That's a really good question. And it's also kind of a really important to go in the heart of it. German media theory was really good, expanding from the classical question of aesthetics in relation to that body of German philosophy as well, and returning it as a part of our questions about thresholds of perception that have to do with human physiology, but also understanding political aesthetics that, for instance, John Cupid and I myself, in a way, assign to as well, in terms of those patterns of making visible. So it really is at the same time a rather concrete way of what sort of patterns of visibility, in terms of allocations or divisions of patterns of visibility, of inclusion, exclusion we're dealing with, that we're dealing with political aesthetics, and then also contrast political of anesthetics in terms of this sort of the other sort of a pole that we inherited from the legacy of Walter Benjamin as well, when he was talking about fascism, kind of a very current topic for our times as well. Fascism is about this anesthetics and that sort of a framing of politics and how we can get rid of that and try to politicize aesthetics as well. That's a very brief answer to a really huge question that indeed should side perhaps of those questions that are pertaining, and this is coming from somebody who works in an art school as well, that one of the kind of key tasks we need to be all the time articulating is that how do we expand our notions, the vocabularies of aesthetics outside the narrow confines of what customers think about aesthetics. There probably would be a bigger story in terms of philosophy as well, in terms of classical philosophy of a German kind, of how we could think through but I'm not going to go into that. I've got some thoughts, but I think I'm going to start rambling in a really confusing manner if I go to that way. But yes, thank you.
Other questions?
Yeah, Carl Bybee, Media Studies, University of Oregon. So when you talk about dead media and you talk about the kind of lifespan of dead media, there's also this idea that media have, as things, they have agency, and they have a lifespan and they have an agency that kind of transcends their original invention. So when someone like Latour starts talking about a parliament of things and starting to have some sort of renewed respect for the things that we've brought into existence, then what do we want to do with this whole legacy of the dead media that we're finding to be kind of enemies of some kind of organic life?
It's an extremely good question as well. While at the same time, I'm always sort of warming up to Latour's perspective and how could one not, of course, because of its significance. There is a really good point that also much smarter people than me have made before, that Spike is really good in pointing out the agency of things and politics of things as well. The weird conceptualization of it as parliament of things is actually returning it really into a weirdly kind of a political history of humans. No? So what if we would overturn the whole question in terms of like other realities of things as well, the junkyard of things, and exporting politics there instead of bringing things to the parliament and the other way around. So hence these other sort of scales, institutional perhaps metaphors sometimes, like laboratory and the planetary level laboratory, become a different way of engaging with this connection of production and scientific knowledge and technological culture, and then really expanding that. A rather concrete way of how to put this into a media studies context has always been to really look at the same time recognizing this sort of a flexibility and potentiality of things in radical ways that we've learned in cultural studies of media and whatnot, crucial, but also looking at how do we then look at media outside its usual compact usefulness and use of words. How do we start looking at components and other things that then really are the concrete afterlife of media as well? In other contexts, I speak of zombie media, slightly playfully as well, but a very particular intent, an intent that really tries to articulate the discourse of afterlife of media and obsolescence of media itself, political concepts, rather centrally political concepts that are not merely about the usual places of histories of media, but actually the junkyards, the discarded electronic situations and such, and trying to, through those territories and situations, try to think of what other sort of use practices and non-use practices are coming about as well. So it's sort of expanding on those notions and trying to perhaps also put into Latour into a bit more radical conversations with issues of politics and issues of economy, and importantly, as I was underlining as well, issues of geography as well, in terms of like where does this happen as well, and to who is what sort of a media is media, what sort of technology is recognizable as technology, instead of as questions of position and spatiality. What is media to where is media, and when is it media and when not anymore media, but something else that carries forward that legacy. Thank you very much for that question, by the way.
Thank you, Dr. Parikh, very much for joining us this morning, and thanks to our audience for some great questions. And I think you have to exit us now. Is that correct? Okay, well,
yes, thank you very much, everyone, and have a great conference again. Thank you.
And now I'd like to welcome Dr. Toby Miller from Loughborough University in London to talk about anthropocentrism versus ecocentrism. Welcome.
Cheers. Can everybody hear me okay? Working well. Just want to say, first of all, thanks to the organisers. Let's give them a little round of applause. And also, I want to apologise because I have to leave right after this. The reason is that I'm co-organising an event in Miami to celebrate George Eudyss's 70th birthday and to do a roast. I'm kind of Don Rickles risen from the grave, doing my impersonation simultaneously of Sammy Davis Jr. and Dino and all those guys. And the date of the conference was shifted because of internal accounting procedures at the University of Miami. i.e. the president wanted to put on a booze up last night and couldn't do it the week before. So I do apologize. So my chat today is about culture's complicity with our environmental crisis. I wrote it in order to think through issues that dog attempts through spectacle and science alike to convince some of the world's public, especially, as Lucy just explained, much of the public in this country, of the reality of our ecological situation, to ask what is life in ways that include philosophy, environmentalism, history, and the social sciences, and can both embody and challenge anthropocentric understandings. It's very clear that we are standing over an abyss. Closer to the mic? That's better, folks? Sorry about that. Our climate is changing in ways that imperil us, our fellow animals, other forms of life, and the very earth itself. Past and present industrial processes have exposed the planet to potentially irrevocable harm. Only last year, finally, the world's scientific community declared 2016 to be that much used word over the last 15 hours, namely an Anthropocene, an epoch characterized by major geological and ecological changes wrought by human activity. Yet despite the evidence, the contours of this abyss are far from clear to many people. There is, as we were just told, a very well-funded climate denial industry that is, of course, responsible for this in large part. But nevertheless, shouldn't something so portentous and lying really directly in front of us be pretty obvious? A complex heritage underpins worldviews that focus on the interests of human beings, anthropocentrism, versus the planet as a whole, ecocentrism. To trace this anthropocentric tendency, I start with a rather tendentious tour d'horizon through stale, pale, male thinkers of the Enlightenment. Why do these people have to be disinterred every 5 minutes? Because they incarnate, my brothers, such ideas and exercise significant ongoing influence. But their work also clarifies the inevitably, inexorably compromised nature of anthropocentrism as it emerges in the latter day and much more significant social sciences. Francis Bacon avowed 4 centuries ago that commerce between the mind of man and the nature of things is more precious than anything on earth. Descartes, whom we heard about yesterday afternoon, argued that reason or good sense exists whole and complete in each of us, and the only thing that makes us men and distinguishes us from the lower animals. A century later, Kant also regarded people as uniquely important because they were conscious of themselves and their place in the world. Through rank and dignity, he said, they were an entirely different being from things, such as irrational animals, with which one can do as one likes. 100 years on, Hegel exalted in a world dominated by human beings' physical and symbolic mastery, avowing that he could put his will into everything, such that an object or place becomes mine. He reasoned that because people are unique in their desire and capacity to conserve objects or destroy them, and represent them via semiosis, a strange dialectical process supposedly affords humans a special right to destroy as well as to conserve. Willpower is independent of simple survival and sets humanity apart from other living things. As per Kant, the capacity to transcend our spontaneity and natural constitution supposedly distinguishes us from other animals. These semiotic abilities permit the destructive use of power, what Hegel called the right of absolute proprietorship. As a consequence, and I'm quoting him, sacred respect for unused land cannot be guaranteed. The necessary relationship between people and nature asserts itself at the core of human consciousness as a struggle to achieve freedom from risk and want. Hegel argued that what he called nature's tedious chronicle, where there is nothing new under the sun, is correctly disrespected and disobeyed by that drive towards progress. And a further century on, Adorno exemplified such tendencies when he defined the Enlightenment as the progressive technical domination of nature. Such talk incarnates two baleful certainties: human sovereignty over the world and a paradoxical guarantee that its exercise will not fundamentally challenge the basis of life. Of course, such anthropocentric positions have been challenged, not least because nature can be so comprehensively altered by technology and labor that it eludes human control. Bacon, Descartes, Hegel, and their kind do not rule the philosophical roost in this domain. For all, for example, his privileging of consciousness, Kant gave an impassioned account of the natural world as equally, and this gets to one of the questions asked earlier, beautiful and sublime, aesthetic and awesome. That paradoxical amalgam forced him to confront a space beyond both nature and human semiosis, a terrifying place where, as he said, the shadows of the boundless void into the abyss before me. There's that A word, the abyss. And this raised a horrifying spectre, a Francis Ford Coppola vision, an apocalyptic vision that one day we may realize there is nothing left, nothing else, nothing beyond, akin to William James later noting that nature is but a name for excess. Such anxieties obliged Kant to recognize that the objects of natural science had a history, and hence, perhaps, a limit on their future. But he remained anthropocentric, convinced that the human being deserves to be called knowledge of the world, even though he constitutes only one part of the creatures on Earth. Hume questioned the dominant anthropocentric perspective. He maintained that animals, like people, learn many things from experience, developing knowledge of the nature of fire, water, earth, stones, heights, depths, etc., in addition to processing instructions as part of their domestication. Rather than being merely sensate, some of our fellow creatures, said David Hume, apply logic through inference, what he called the reason of animals. More simplistically, if empathetically, Bentham asked this of our duty of care to animals. The question is not, can they reason, nor can they talk, but can they suffer? And even Kant acknowledged animals' capacity for reflection. But it took Engels, 150 years ago, to recognize the fundamental truth of environmentalism, that nature does not just exist, as he put it, but comes into being and passes away. Engels noted existing philosophy's peculiar faith in the absolute immutability of nature, that however nature might itself have come into being, once present in this dominant doxa, it remained as it was as long as it continued to exist, that everything could remain as it had been since the beginning. And in that context, Rosa Luxemburg criticized attempts to seek refuge and repose in nature against the pastoralists, without observing that its very existence was compromised and shortened by industrial capital. As Engels poignantly put it, the emergence of human beings marks the evolutionary point where nature attains consciousness of itself. Clearly this was a debt to Kant, a debt to Hegel, but Engels realized that people therefore had the ability and responsibility to observe and speak for those without voices and protect those without power, a point Anne Schwenkenbecker and others make today. While our fellow animals are capable of transforming their living conditions, they do so without an evident, deliberate, and elaborated codification of what this achieves or means. But that does not make us, humans, and our interests superordinate. With special capacities come additional expectations. Human labor's transformation and marshalling of nature has immiserated as well as sustained the many workers who service capitalism's growth and profit. An equally material impact of the ideology of growth has been to undo nature in a way that is laden with unimagined consequences. That mythology of innovation and adoption mixes the sublime, the awesome, the ineffable, the uncontrollable, the powerful, with the beautiful, he said, pointing to his T-shirt, which says, Pluto, never forget, from that brief period of history when it was deemed not to be a planet. That mythology of innovation and adoption mixes the sublime, the awesome, the ineffable, the uncontrollable, the powerful, with the beautiful, the approachable, the attractive, the pliant, the soothing. In some kinds of philosophical aesthetics, the sublime and the beautiful are regarded as opposites. But the aesthetic and the sublime have blended in the technological sublime, a totemic, quasi-sacred quality that industrial societies cathectically ascribe to modern machinery, engineering, design, and marketing, as simultaneously beautiful and powerful. Hello, Mr. Ulmer's apple. The emergence of a technological sublime has been attributed to Japanese, Western European, and US, and now South Korean, achievements of the post-Second World War period, when new consumer products supposedly supplanted the capacity of nature to inspire fear and astonishment. This technological sublime derives from an earlier process, what Marx called the fetishism that attaches itself to the products of labour once these objects are in the hands of consumers, who lust after them as if they were independent beings. Today's commodities elicit desire by wooing consumers, wooing customers, glancing at them sexually and looking pretty in ways that borrow from romantic love but proceed to reverse that relationship. People learn about romantic life from commodified humanity, hyper-extended beyond the norm in a complex mix of marketing methods, social signs, and national emblems. Capitalists, technocrats, blue-collar workers, consumers, citizens, critics, artists, religionists, soldiers, and fans are all implicated in the environmental impact of this fetishism. And the cost is sizable. On an average day, each person in the world generates 1.2 kilograms of post-consumer waste. That amounts to 1.3 billion tons of garbage a year, a figure that doubled over this century's first decade and accounts for 5% of greenhouse gas emissions. The contents of this consumption have changed beyond anyone's imagination. In 1965, who here was alive in 1965? Who was buying things in 1965? I see you. I raise you. In 1965, fewer than 12 materials were in wide use: wood, brick, iron, copper, gold, silver, and a handful of plastics. Today, there is a comprehensive materials basis to modern society. The computer chip that enabled me to type what I wrote today contains more than 60 of them. And these new materials are repeatedly taken as signs of progress. Developments in the alloys that bind them together and form new ones have indeed frequently led to greater efficiency and sometimes even diminished greenhouse gas emissions. But the notion of endless growth and progress, as we've heard this morning already, fails to acknowledge that unearthing these things is a drain on natural resources. We have a finite supply of the basic ingredients of modern material life, and potential substitutes, many of which have been tried over the last 40 years, rarely deliver equivalent quality. There is hope, if you can call this hope. Plato referred to the power of natural disasters to destroy social and technological advances, which he called crafty devices. When these tools were destroyed, he thought, kind of crypto-Schumpeterian avant la lettre that he was, new inventions and a pacific society based on restraint rather than excess could emerge. And for Engels, for Marx, for Luxemburg, recognizing oneself as a species could only generate class consciousness over consumer sovereignty, could not only generate class consciousness over consumer society, but expand that awareness beyond identifying oneself as a member of a class to encompass other forms of life. Plus, a corrective to the technological sublime originates from the very heart of this beguiling discourse. Famously, in his testimony before the US Atomic Energy Commission in the 1950s, Robert Oppenheimer, who led the group that developed the atomic bomb, talked about the instrumental rationality that animated his colleagues. Once they saw what was feasible, the device's murderous impact lost intellectual and emotional significance for them. They were smitten by what he called the technically sweet. Just such technological saccharin is the lifeblood of the technological sublime. But as Oppenheimer showed, even its closest adherents may sometimes step outside their immediate circumstances and pleasures to provide us with critical insights into the emotional appeal that can underpin instrumental rationality, albeit way too late in this case. The lesson is clear. Nature's duality, that it is simultaneously self-generating and sustaining, yet its survival is contingent on human rhetoric and despoliation makes it vulnerable. Its reaction to our interference will strike back sooner or later in mutually assured destruction. Without nature, there can be no humanity. Changes in the material world caused by people and their tools compromise the survival of the planet's most skillful and willful, productive and destructive inhabitant. Okay, on now to the social sciences, because beneath these lofty debates, floating towards us from an all too dimly perceived history of philosophy, more mundane but much more efficacious social scientific accounts of the environment proliferate. They're dominated by three discursive formations: economics to assess exchange value, psychology to evaluate individuals, and sociology to comprehend societies. They reference and condition how we respond to the findings of climate scientists. Environmental economics focuses on climate change as a consequence of the supposed absence of pure market forces, whose allegedly invisible digit guides us all to nirvana. Dutifully obeying the données of reactionary fans of an imaginary capitalism, it argues that once prices are placed on such negative externalities as pollution, everything can be put to rights through the operation of supply and demand. On the other hand, ecological economists are on the fringe of this parent discipline because they call for serious restraints on growth via governments limiting unbridled impacts on our future. And they use a variety of forms of thought, not just the supply and demand fantasy, to comprehend and counter climate change. Carefully evaluating the technologies and materials that can support human populations and nature, they aim to avoid undue stress on all participants. Their ecological footprint instrument measures environmental value, not monetary exchange, and prioritizes supposedly sustainable life over productivity and profit. It calculates global environmental capacity by hectare and judges sustainability numerically. Feminist economists have also called for the consideration of elements not generally assumed relevant by neoclassicists, because they transcend market pricing and because they seek often to bring the sensate body into analyses of environmental impact. As part of an ongoing dispute with binary divisions between nature and culture, feminist theory has also interrogated the notion of progress as productivist and accumulationist. Some strands, of course, posit an essential distinction between men and women that finds the former responsible for the theory and practice of environmental destruction, and the latter as conversely blessed and cursed with unshakable connections to the earth due to their enhanced experience of food gathering, human reproduction, and caregiving. But even these heterodox social scientists generally remain shy of phrasing the real question, the one that haunts both neoclassical Coreans and dutiful Marxists, who are equally dedicated to the triumphant march of development, namely the requirement to set significant limits to consumption by restricting the generation of need and the exploitation of scarcity, and hence binding the twin arms of capitalism in a controlling embrace. How might this be achieved, given the compelling commercial forces unleashed by the technological sublime? On the score of consumption as the expression of individual desire, social psychology and neuropsychology indicate that although public concern for the environment does not always hew strictly to political ideology, in the United States at least, the effectiveness of ecological information depends to a significant extent on its capacity to communicate across political lines. People who do not regard themselves as directly affected by climate change may adopt environmental values when stimulated to think beyond their own lives and engage cross-generational impacts, to consider, in an anthropocentric way, the lives of those yet to be. Environmental discourse in public service announcements and newspaper editorials generally frames ecological risk through moral arguments about harm and care. This resonates most effectively with progressives. When pro-environmental discourse shifts into the visceral domain of purity and disgust, look at this awful happening, it appeals to reactionaries. This would be one explanation of the bombing of Syria by Tiberius yesterday. Functional magnetic resonance imaging of brain activity shows that whereas avowed political liberals in US terms respond to risk with social and self-awareness, conservatives are more attuned to threats and rewards to themselves and those around them. Some psi discourse emphasizes the source of attitudes rather than this brain activity stuff. Longitudinal studies suggest that people familiar with climate change evidence are confirmed in their beliefs by personal experience of it, while those with less knowledge can be stirred to commitment when directly confronted by environmental events. These findings align with cognitive linguistic research on environmental framing, ideology, and political partisanship. For its part, environmental sociology struggles against both extrapolations from the magic mechanics of supply and demand and a focus on what goes on in people's heads, the latest incarnations of what sociologists from the 70s started calling the human exceptionalism paradigm that emerged from Hegel's view of people as the sole living creatures that make culture. As we have seen, that regrettably influential model allocates to us and us alone the right and the capacity to exercise sovereignty over the earth, but the model remains under challenge. For while early modernity was dedicated to producing and distributing goods in a struggle for the most effective and efficient forms of industrialization, with devil take the hindmost and no thought for the environment, today's risk society involves enumerating, euphemizing, and managing those dangers. In recognition of that reality, environmental Marxism has emerged over the last 2 decades, connecting nature to capital and labor as constitutive variables of analysis, favoring regulation of business and work in accord with ecological principles. Populations face crises brought on by deliberate policies: nuclear energy, genocidal weaponry, biotechnology, industrial pollution, professional miscalculations, and scientific discoveries hurtling out of control. This is on vivid display in attempts to bend human nature to the tastes of the present, something Habermas has written about very effectively, to intervene so that the people of the future can have fast-twitch muscle fibers, blue eyes, or religious fantasies built into them. Obviously, deep ecology presents the most venerable and severe challenge to both social, scientific, and public policy anthropomorphism. But its unremitting ecocentrism poses some major democratic difficulties, notably the insistence on restricted population growth and zero pleasurable consumption, and it assumes a capacity to avoid the dominance of commercial propaganda. Amartya Sen seeks to bridge the divides that separate some of the perspectives that I've summarized. He favors, if you like, a midpoint between anthropocentric and ecocentric worldviews. Little quotation, then one more bit, and then the old boy sits down. The impact of the environment on human lives must be among the principal considerations in assessing the value of the environment, says Sen. To take an extreme example, he offers, in understanding why the eradication of smallpox is not viewed as an impoverishment of nature. We do not tend to lament, he says, the environment is poorer since the smallpox virus has disappeared. In general terms, even Bacon recognized we must wait upon nature instead of vainly affecting to overrule her. Edmund Burke acknowledged each generation as what he called temporary possessors and life renters of the natural and social world. People must maintain chain and continuity rather than act ephemerally as if they were flies of summer, thus ensuring a partnership not only between those who are living, but between those who are living, those who are dead, and those who are to be born. This would sustain, he thought, the great primeval contract of eternal society. And such intergenerational care has long been a centerpiece of much African American and indigenous environmental thought, as well as these quite conservative authors. Human beings are the most powerful and destructive creatures on earth. We have a special responsibility to repeat, to speak for and defend others, to support a world given to us that may hold unthought of benefits for our descendants, if only it is maintained for them, but not only for them. And that commitment might help us to understand and appreciate life.
We do have a few minutes for questions, and anyone?
Thank you. That was excellent. How does that bring about a new understanding of a modern sense of stewardship? Like where do we go and get the millennials, where there's a vast number of them, to understand that it's in their interest and our interest to do all that? And then how do we go about teaching that?
Right, great question. A lot of this research I was relying on, the social research, psychological research, is about the United States. So even though it claims to be engaged in universals about cerebration and conviction and commitment, so my comments need to be understood through that lens. It seems to me that one of the benefits of anthropocentrism, once it is acknowledged for what it is and how it works, is it can appeal very much to quite conservative people. If you can get Edmund Burke on your side, if you can get Plato on your side, then you have, masters of Western civilization speaking a language that even very reactionary people can appreciate. If you can show them that Kant could envisage an end to nature and also a beginning to nature, in other words, that it had a history, you'd be getting something. Because after all, what climate change scientists do is history, as they keep trying to tell us whenever something goes slightly skew-whiff in the hockey graph. Not that it's doing that very often. This is like genetics. It's globules of history piling in on top of one another, clashing, producing new things. In that sense, there is a kind of Hegelian synthesis. So it seems to me there can be an appeal for those who are on the conservative side of politics in terms of the traditions of conservation, what that word is supposed to be about. It also seems to me that in terms of those who are prepared to think about more radical alternatives, there is a way in which talking about these objects, as the previous speaker did so eloquently, can be very effective. Let me talk to you about how. So I teach in Colombia much of the time, and I teach about electronic waste from, I guess, a philosophical perspective in Chile, Colombia, and Mexico. And people my age, normally lighter skinned, normally male, say, we're sick of you people coming from the global north and telling us we can't have development. You've gotten to do all this, now you're telling us we can't. Younger people, often indigenous, mixed race, whatever US-style language one uses, already know about these issues because their mothers and fathers are making these technologies in the formal sector, normally, and then disposing of them in the informal sector, and under both sets of circumstances in extremely unhealthy and dangerous ways, particularly in terms of reproductive rights. So my experience, and it's true right across the US, Spain, France, Britain, and Hong Kong, where I talk about this stuff a lot as well, is that young people actually know about issues such as the ecological impact and the slave impact of the mining of substances that generate their pleasures or their work necessities technologically, and also about the detritus of their post-consumer worlds. So one way to get them to think, the post-consumer worlds of these objects, one way to get such people to think environmentally is then to say, well, reach into your pocketbook and pull out your phone. How was this invented? Where was it made? What electricity does it use? What electricity and how is it sourced that is used for its information to travel? And where does it go after you've had it? And that kind of circuit, a bit like in the old media studies model of understanding the text and the reception, but extending it into the production of the object and then its post-consumer life. That is a way, it seems to me, of getting people to think very expansively about the entire existence of the materials that form the basis to their social world.
Thank you. Thanks, Toby. That was wonderful. I'm Salma Monani from Gettysburg College, and I found that very thought-provoking and very interesting. And I want to actually follow up on this because one of the things, since I come from a liberal arts college, which is full of young and actually very conservative people, I can get them to think, but they tend to often have a skepticism then, or a sense of overwhelming pessimism of we're basically fucked. right?
To use the technical term.
To use the technical term.
I use that one myself.
And I think that comes from this notion of the technological sublime, right? That we are trapped in these systems. So I was wondering if you could perhaps talk about that and maybe sort of think of how once we move beyond the thinking to what we might do in terms of agency.
Great, thanks. So we have to be out of here at 10. But your starter for 10 is, what is the answer to this? So it seems to me that, again, history can be a guide and an aid. The idea of a technological sublime derived from American studies. It derived from attempts to understand the relationship between commodities and technologies in the sustained takeoff of the US economy after the Second World War. All those data we were given about how quickly boats and tanks could be made, how that then engendered a massive boom driven in part by consumption in the post-Second World War period. And that notion of a technological sublime has given a lot of weight to people thinking about the history and the future of what they do. And that idea, I think, can be married to ideas of things like child rearing. It can be married to ideas like simply looking after your garden. You know, in other words, it can be turned into, think of the sense of responsibility that you have or which you want others to have about nature. That's one way to deal with it. The second way is to say, look, maybe we can't actually reverse things, but we can stop hurtling in the direction where we're heading. But the most important thing in this country, much more than anywhere else, is the hyper-consumerist attitude that is fed to us and accepted by us on a daily basis. And to get people to engage in a certain amount